Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the archives tonight to the William G. McGowan Theater. Our guest this evening is Annette Gordon-Reed, author of the Hemingses of Monticello. This Pulitzer Prize-winning history tells the complex yet compelling story of 4 generations of a slave family that came to be owned by Thomas Jefferson, the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence. The book is the outgrowth of a childhood interest that our guest had in Thomas Jefferson. Early on, she read a biography of him that was narrated by a fictional slave boy. Then she joined the Book of the Month Club and didn't tell them she was a minor so she could get Faun Brodys' biography of Jefferson. This childhood interest in Jefferson deepened as she went on to Dartmouth College, where she studied Jefferson and his times as a history major. This further fueled her intellectual passion for learning more about Jefferson and about his relationship with his slaves. After graduating from Dartmouth in 1981, it was off to Harvard Law School, where she was a member of the Harvard Law Review. And out of Harvard Law, she was an associate at a New York firm, as well as counsel to the New York City Board of Corrections. Today, Ms. Gordon-Reed is professor of law at New York Law School, as well as professor of history at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. She also speaks at conferences around the country on history and law-related topics. And fortunately for all of us, she has found time to write books, including Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy in 1997. It was well received by critics, but other Jefferson biographers questioned her research about Jefferson's relationship with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, that indicated that Jefferson could have fathered some or all of Hemings' children. Soon after the book was published, however, it was reported that DNA tests showed a definite link between Jefferson and Hemings' youngest child, Eston. She has pursued this subject in her latest book, The Hemingses of Monticello. It not only won the 2009 Pulitzer Prize for History, but also the National Book Award for Nonfiction, an event that I attended, and this is my program for the event, which she just signed. The Society for Historians of Early American Republic Book Award, the George Washington Book Prize, the Frederick Douglass Book Prize, among others. In the foreword to her book, Gordon-Reed describes what it was like during her research to hold Jefferson's farm book. It was in this book that he kept records of his slaves, writing with the same hand that in the summer of 1776 put on parchment the words, "All men are created equal." Gordon-Reed wrote, "It was wrenching to hold the original and to know that Jefferson's actual hand had dipped into the inkwell and touched these pages to create what was to me a record of human oppression. It took my breath away." It was her scholarship and her dedication to a full accounting of history that moved the Foundation for the National Archives to award her its prestigious annual Records of Achievement Award this past fall. The Foundation, as many of you know, actively and generously supports our educational and public programs throughout the year. You too can become a supporter of the National Archives or even a friend or member of the Foundation. The table outside the theater has information on the Foundation and the Archives and our future programs, as well as other information. And you can sign up for our mailing list for the calendar of events. The program you received tonight as you walked in also has more information on our guests and a list of upcoming programs. Tonight, copies of our speaker's book are available for sale, and she will be in the lobby after the program to sign them. And now on with the program, please welcome our guest, Annette Gordon-Reed.
Thank you very much, David. It's great to be back at the National Archives, and thank everyone for coming out on this much colder evening than I thought it was going to be. I came from Boston, and I expect that to be chilly, but I thought I was in the South. I guess not. But it's really good to be here. If somebody had told me when I first started working on my first book about the controversy or the writings, the historiography about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, that I would be standing here tonight so many years later talking about the same thing, I would have said you were crazy. This was something that struck me as, I knew people were interested in it, but a particular esoteric interest of mine, and it was something that I wanted to say in that first book. I didn't know how it would be received. I didn't know if lots of people were as interested as I was, but it was, I don't want to say a lark, but it was something that was deeply personal for me, and it's been interesting and fascinating to see how it just keeps unfolding, the various aspects of it, to the point that I am here now, after having written my first book. Started writing it in 1994, or actually the beginning of 1995, to here we are, approaching 2010, and it's still Tom and Sally. But it's a fascinating subject, and the reason that I came to it is because I think it's about something, I've always thought it was about something larger than the question of whether or not a slave owner had children with an enslaved woman, which was a pretty commonplace thing to have happen. The difference here being that Jefferson is a founding father, and that's why people fixated on it. I started the first book because I thought I would talk a little bit about the relationship between the two books. My plan was to, and what I did in the first book was to write about the historiography of Jefferson and Hemings, not so much did they or didn't they have a long-term relationship, but what people wrote about it, how scholars wrote about the topic, and how their approach to the topic, what it said about the nature of race relations in America, presently, at the time that people were writing, and what it said about the craft of history. History as a mechanism of conveying the country's story. What do you do when you have stories that are inconvenient, stories that are problematic, stories that show the country in a much more, in a complicated light, something less than stellar light, and how is that treated? Now, interestingly enough, when I was writing, the craft of history, historiography, had changed very, very much. The writing of the history of slavery, as I've often said, is really the crown jewel of American historiography. There have been wonderful works. When you think of the great historians of the last 40 and 50 years, names like John Hope Franklin, Edmund Morgan, C. Van Woodward, these people have crafted marvelous works about the subject of history. And the interesting thing about it is that because it was not written about for so long, there's so much to be learned, and there's so much yet to be discovered and interpreted. So the writing of history itself, when I started writing about this topic in 1994, 1995, had progressed a great deal. We were living in part of a golden age that is still continuing. But there was something about this particular place, Monticello, that was sort of in a time warp, in a way, or had been stopped. The time had stood still on this particular topic. We talked about, historians talked about the importance of bringing the voices and the experiences of enslaved people into the narrative, to talk about slave agency, talk about all kinds of things everywhere else, but this particular topic and this particular subject matter in this particular place. And I think it's because, I'm pretty sure it's because of who Jefferson was, the role that he plays, what he symbolizes to Americans, and that it made it very, very difficult to bring to bear all those other things that you saw everywhere else in the writing about history in this particular place. I think maybe George Washington in Mount Vernon may be another. He may be another figure that is sort of problematic because he's the father of the country. There's enormous respect for a person who was the first leader of the country and one of the first leaders to walk away from power with an army, to just leave that and go back to his farm instead of saying, I'm going to be there forever and ever. I mean, getting from one person to the next is the problem that all countries and countries today are still grappling with. How do you do that without bloodshed and violence? And he set that example. And so there's that part of Washington that people admire, but he was also a slaveholder. So how do you reconcile those two things? So I think Jefferson and Washington, Madison, nobody pays very much attention to Madison on this score. I mean, Madison he's the father of the Constitution. He's the one who is seen as the intellectual, the person who sort of brings Jefferson down to earth when he's flying off into the stratosphere. But people almost forget that he was a slaveholder, right? And he died, and he didn't free his slaves either. But somehow, he gets I don't want to say a pass, but it may be because he is not as interesting to as many people. I mean, he's intellectually interesting, but personally, he doesn't grab people, as many people as, say, Washington or Franklin, or he's not as, or even Adams, the sort of irascible figure that some people inexplicably have grafted onto, but that's another story. That's not fair. I was being provocative there, but yeah, I mean, there are other figures who loom much larger than Madison, even though Madison was a slaveholder, and he had sort of a similar trajectory in life as Jefferson on this topic. But because Jefferson, as David mentioned, wrote the Declaration of Independence, there's a special charge. I mean, we hold him accountable for things in ways that I think in some ways are unfair, because the way he felt about slavery, the way he felt about race in particular, these were things that were common currency among the founding fathers. But because he gave us our foundational document, the thing that we're supposed to live up to, he is held to a higher standard than other people, and that's what makes his failure to live up to those things, those ideals, disappointing for people. So there's, on one hand, this sense of a founding father who was part of the creation of the nation, something that is very, very important. On the other hand, there's the slaveholding part of it. There's the Jefferson of the Notes of the state of Virginia, venturing it as a suspicion that blacks are inferior to whites and that white blood improves black people, all those kinds of things that he's putting down on paper that are jarring to modern ears and are anathema to people of goodwill. And so there's this dual problem here with him. And I do think for most of the time of writing about Jefferson, most of the biographers of Jefferson sort of were on the great founding father side of the ledger and didn't really pay very much attention to slavery, Jefferson as a slaveholder. It's fascinating. One of the things that I want to do after I'm going to do another volume about the Hemings family, but then I want to attempt to write about Jefferson. When people say to me, well, what's left to be said? It's everything. I mean, there is so much material. I mean, when I was working on the Hemingses, there were so many times I would go through documents or see documents up at Monticello in the research department, and I'd say, why has no one written about this? Why has no one written about this? Why has no one written about this? I mean, I don't mean anything salacious, but just about the nature of life, of plantation life in Monticello. You don't really find that in the biographies of Jefferson. They are mainly political biographies, and there's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, he was a great political figure, and he was an important political figure. But the other part of his life was largely remained hidden, I think, from people. And it wasn't something that was written about by his biographers. And so once you start to peel that back and to write about it, I think people were surprised. People were a little uncomfortable about it. I think there was a little bit of embarrassment on the part of people who were of his biographers, because there was this aspect of his life that was so at odds with the thing that had brought them, that had made them admire him in the first place. That he's a slave owner and a person who wrote the Declaration of Independence. But of course, that's the great paradox of American life. I mean, to me, Jefferson is, in some ways, I mean, he gets in, you know, it's almost unfair, but he embodies American contradiction in quite an interesting way, which makes him such a compelling figure, and studying his life a compelling thing. So, whereas some people might see that complication as a problem and worry that it means, oh, this means that therefore he has to be, you know, kicked off a pedestal, or we can't recognize the things that are important. To me, it's the American story, writ in one person, in one place, that you can study and think about the paradoxes and the complications, and a way of bringing all of that out. So I sort of welcome the idea of complexity, as opposed to thinking that it is something that means that he can't, that we have to turn our backs on him, and this is something that means that he can't, that we don't recognize his contributions to the country. So with the first book, what I wanted to try to do was to explain what I think had gone wrong with the way Jefferson biographers had treated the subject of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And I'm sure most of you know the basic outlines of this. In 1802, a man named James Callender printed for the first time in newspapers. There had been blind items. Do people know the New York Post? The New York Post and it has something called Page 6. It's a gossip page. And it has blind items, what, starlet was seen leaving the restaurant. Well, there had been that kind of stuff about Jefferson before James Callender wrote. In the 1790s, there were blind items about a statesman from Virginia and, sort of innuendo. And you could figure out, obviously, who they were talking about. But James Callender wrote this story about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings in 1802 and says the president, the title of the first column was called The President Again, because he'd been attacking Jefferson for lots of other things up until this point. And he was the first person to really put the name Sally into the public domain in relationship to Jefferson. And James Callender had been a political ally of Jefferson's, but when Jefferson became president, Jefferson did not give him a job as a postmaster. I mean, James Callender was one of those sort of attack dog people that you have in a campaign, but then when you win and they say, oh, give me a responsible audience, and they say, no, you're an attack dog. We don't give attack dogs jobs. That's not your function. And so Jefferson didn't give him the job, and so he turned on Jefferson. And so that's when the story begins. Jefferson's political enemies tried to use this against him to try to say that he should not be reelected. It didn't work. He was reelected resoundingly in the next election, and his party came in with a huge majority. He bought Louisiana, he bought double the size of the United States. People didn't care. Either they didn't believe the story or they didn't care whether or not he had a mistress. He bought the West for them, and they were going west, so they reelected him, and it wasn't a problem. The story died down and was sort of revived pretty much in the 1840s and the 1850s. Abolitionists used the story of Jefferson and Hemings to talk about the abuse of enslaved women during slavery, saying, the best blood of Virginia can be found on the auction blocks. And they were talking about Jefferson, a reference to him and to other people as well. The story dies down again and doesn't appear as very much until 1873, when a man named Madison Hemings, who lived out in Ohio, was interviewed by a journalist, and he told the story of living at Monticello and that he was the son of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And he talks about Jefferson a little bit less about his mother and about his siblings. And there was another man in the same area a man named Israel Jefferson. His real name was Israel Gillette, but they just tacked the name Jefferson onto to him, basically corroborated what he said. Now, these recollections appeared in the newspaper, and one of the interesting things that I found in that area, looking at newspapers in that area, people during that time period didn't seem to have a problem. I mean, there were some people who attacked him, but there were other references in other newspapers to Jefferson having had children with enslaved women, and it was sort of treated as if it wasn't a controversial thing. So, I mean, the idea that this was something that all along people did not accept, in the 1870s and the 1880s, there are a number of articles and references to this in newspapers by whites who refer to this as this is something that was true. And I think, when I think about this, when I do the second volume, I'm going to try to analyze this a little bit more, is because it was so common at the time period. And Americans today, the historians who were writing in the 20th century, that whole history of relations between white men and black women was sort of lost in a way. I mean, people in the 1870s understood that this was something that happened quite commonly. So it didn't seem to be a big deal to the people at that time period. So these recollections come out in 1873, and they're lost. They're found again in the 1950s when a man named John Dos Passos, who was a novelist, a famous novelist, who also had an interest in Jefferson, found them. And he shared those recollections, at least Madison Hemings's, with Jefferson scholars. And so it was never referred to in biographies until the 1960s. They sort of said, well, there was this person who said this, but we don't credit it. And as David mentioned, he talks about Faun Brodys' biography that appeared in 1974, was the first book that talked about Jefferson and Hemings as part of her biography. She did a biography of Jefferson, and she accepted the story as true. Winthrop Jordan had written about it in 1968 in White Over Black, another famous Southern historian. But he had said, well, I don't know whether it's true or not, but he was agnostic on it. But that in itself made lots of people angry, that he was willing to say, that such a prominent scholar was willing to say, well, you know, I don't know, it could have happened, we don't know. But Faun Brodys went the extra step and wrote as if this were true and created a firestorm of controversy. So what she does in that book is she reproduced the recollections of Madison Hemings and Israel Gillette Jefferson in the back of her book. And that was the first time when I got my Book of the Month Club version of this book that I actually saw, and I was 14, I saw Madison Hemings and Israel Jefferson's recollections about life at Monticello, and it was the first narrative from an enslaved person that I'd ever read. And I found it fascinating to think of what it would be like to be the son of your master. Your father owns you. Your father is your father and has that connection that fathers have to sons, but your father owns you as well, can buy and sell you, as often happened during slavery. And so that story, that thinking about that concept and what it said about slavery, because slavery, people think of slavery mainly as an institution where people are working and not getting paid, which it was. You think of the auction block, you think of the lash, but it was also an institution where different racially based slavery, and that's the important thing about America, the only system of really just racially based slavery, you had these two groups who were living together and creating biological families together as well. That was a part of slavery too, is the mixing of the races. They're doing population genetics, geneticists are doing lots of work now, doing sort of studies in different communities where they have discovered that in some communities, African American males have upwards of 45% of them have European Y male chromosomes. Henry Louis Gates, Skip Gates did this thing about national basketball players, and it's this huge percentage of people, meaning they have, and this is just guys, I mean, this doesn't account for white men who had children with black women who had daughters, because daughters don't have the Y chromosome. They check this through the Y chromosome. Or people who had sons who then had daughters. So we're talking a huge percentage of people there, and that didn't happen in the 20th century. This is something that is a product of slavery, of the 18th and 19th century, the kind of mixing that went on when people were living in close proximity. It's very difficult for us. I mean, Americans, black and white Americans today live pretty much separate lives, segregated in urban areas, segregated by neighborhoods and so forth. But Monticello, if you've ever been to Monticello, it's a relatively small place that Jefferson is living on top of the mountain with upwards of 200 black people and an overseer and maybe an overseer and his 4 or 5 kids. These people are all living together at that point. And when you have men and women living together, and when you have men who have control over the bodies of women, some of those women are going to be raped, and there are going to be some people who form liaisons. People are going to mix, and they're going to have long-term liaisons, which is another thing that happened at Monticello as well. So all of this stuff is, the Jefferson Hemings story brings this to the fore, and it was something that I think that was discomforting to the first historians who wrote about this. Duma Malone and Merrill Peterson, the great biographers of Jefferson, not just from the standpoint of, well, there was sex, obviously, and sex is a difficult topic for some people to write about. Historians may shy away from that. There's interracial sex, which is a problem. You got to remember, up until 1967, it was against the law for black people and white people to marry each other in Virginia. So you're accusing Jefferson not only of, you're accusing Jefferson of a crime in some quarters, the way some people would see it, and fornication, certainly outside of marriage. So there was the prudery, the sense of this is some sort of unseemly story. All this influenced the way people viewed viewed the topic. So in my first book, what I wanted to do was to sort of unpack that a little bit, to talk about how they wrote about this, to sort of double standard of what I thought of the view of evidence. When black people in the story said something happened, it was discounted. When whites said something, when the Jefferson family told a different story, even though I was able to point it, even though it was clear that a lot of the things that they were saying were untrue, it was treated as truth. And so it was a bigger question for me, as I said, not just did Tom and Sally have an affair, but how you view evidence. Because this is a lesson that can apply to other historical works as well, not just about whether or not someone had an affair. How do you view the words of black people in slavery? And it's a tough thing because part of the nature of slavery was the devaluation of enslaved people's voices, right? I mean, being a slave means you don't count in a way. So how can you write history not adapting the attitudes of the people who were in the 18th century? On one hand, you have to get to their mindset, but you don't have to accept, the way they viewed blacks in writing when you're actually writing the history, and that's what I thought was happening there. So from writing that first book, I thought, well, one of the reasons that it's so easy, I think, to dismiss the story of the Hemingses, what they said about who they were, was that people don't really know anything about them at all. I thought, maybe if readers had more of a stake in this family, if they knew them as people instead of as a sort of monolithic group of enslaved people, if I could make people see them as individuals, it might have some effect on the way people viewed them and read about their story. So that was the genesis of the Hemingses of Monticello. The first book is more analytical. As I said, I'm looking at what other people wrote and sort of picking that apart. The Hemingses of Monticello is a narrative. It tells the story of the Hemings family, beginning with Elizabeth Hemings, the matriarch, who was born in 1735. And the family comes to Monticello in 1774. All of them are assembled there in 1774 to live on the mountain for the next 50 years. People who have a connection to Monticello more continuous in some ways than Jefferson. I mean, we think of Jefferson at Monticello, but he was a public man. He was in public life for most of his adulthood. And once he comes back, he goes to France in 1784. And from 1784 up until 1809, when he comes back to Monticello in retirement, he's gone a huge amount of time at Monticello. Half the time, even when he's president, he's away half the time, and when he's Secretary of State, he's away most of the time. So the Hemings family and other enslaved people are in this place continuously a lot longer than he is. And so what I really wanted to establish, the Hemingses of Monticello, the cover of the book, the cover of the book makes it look like it's their house, right? The Hemingses, and this is their house. And that's the idea is to say, this is Jefferson's place. Monticello is the home of Thomas Jefferson, but it's also the home of these other people. And so when you think about Monticello, think about them as well, the Hemingses, but also the other enslaved people who lived there. Jefferson, over the course of his life, owned about 700 people. When you think about, when you can take in births and deaths and sales and so forth, that's a lot of folks. And the Hemingses were, because they were close to him for lots of reasons, they, more than any other family there, except maybe the Grangers, another family that I talk about in the book, they are anchored to this particular place, and it is theirs, not legally, but theirs in a particular sort of way. So I have the story of Elizabeth Hemings, who was the mistress of, well, concubine is the term that their grandson used, Madison Hemings. Madison Hemings, in his recollection, tells his family story, and Elizabeth Hemings became the concubine of a man named John Wales, who was also Jefferson's wife's father. So Elizabeth Hemings has 6 children with him. The youngest was Sarah Hemings, who is Sally Hemings. Her name was Sarah. Sally is a nickname. And so Jefferson's wife when he marries her, and when her father dies and she inherits his property, brings her 6 half-siblings to live at Monticello. Now, if that's an image, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around the idea that, first, having slaves, but then to have slaves, have your brothers and sisters who are your siblings. Now, different people handle that different ways. Some people made no connection of it at all, made nothing of it at all. They would sell their siblings, didn't do anything, it sort of got them out of the way. They were embarrassed by them. Martha, we don't really have Martha's words about any of these. We don't have any of Martha's letters. Maybe we have 2 letters from her, but they are sort of form letters about, they don't have anything to do with their personal life. But I find it fascinating that she would bring her siblings to Monticello and sort of install them as her favored house servants. The women are the maids. Sally Hemings becomes a companion to Martha's daughters. In other words, her nieces, her half-nieces. Jefferson takes Robert Hemings, Sally's older brother, as his personal valet, replacing him. Robert is 12 at this point. His valet before then had been a man named Jupiter Evans, who was the same age as Jefferson. So a 30-year-old was replaced with a 12-year-old boy who travels around with Jefferson. He's with him when he writes the Declaration of Independence. So this family, this sort of weird, bizarre Southern family of slaves and siblings and, favored people. When Martha dies in 1782, Sally Hemings and her sisters are around the bedside, along with Martha's other full white sisters and her sisters-in-law. They're the ones who are taking care of Martha. And Martha gives Sally Hemings a memento before she dies, a bell that is on display at Monticello now. So, this image of this family tells you a great deal about the nature and the complexity of Southern society, and that's one of the things that I write about. And I write about the individual people in the family besides Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings is interesting, but she, to me, is not the most interesting member of the family. I think her mother, Elizabeth, would be a fascinating person to talk to because she would be a person who would know everybody. Her brother, James, who goes with Jefferson to France to learn how to become a French chef, is another fascinating character. Readers come up to me all the time. I get letters from people who want to find out more about James, and I tried to find every single thing that I could. I talk about him in Paris with Jefferson. He goes to France to learn how to become a chef. He apprentices in some of the best houses, some of the great houses in Paris. Chantilly, the chateau of the Prince de Condé, who was a member of the royal family. Chantilly is this huge space. It had a stable for 268 horses, to give you a sense of the magnitude of this. That's why they had a French Revolution, the kind of opulence of this place. And James Hemings is there. You just think of a 19-year-old who comes from the middle of nowhere, and then he's in Paris, 700,000 people, seeing the chateau, places, things that would never, indoor plumbing at the Hotel de Langeac that you would never have had in Virginia. And I talk about his experience. Sally Hemings comes to Paris a couple of years after that, and both of them are paid wages while they are in Paris. Paid very good wages, as a matter of fact. Jefferson, the people I've consulted about this who know about wage rates in the 1780s tell me, look at Jefferson's list and say, well, gosh, he was paying people lots of money. Everybody lots of money, maybe overpaying people. So you have these 2 young African-American people who are in a foreign country, in a French-speaking country, having to work with other servants and learn another language. And at the end of their stay, when Jefferson wants to come back home, Sally Hemings, who is, Madison Hemings says, pregnant by Jefferson at this point, doesn't want to go home because France was technically free soil. Everybody who filed a petition for freedom in France had the petition granted. So she and her brother could have remained in Paris as free people, and she thought about doing that. Jefferson persuaded her to come home, that she would have a decent life, and that her children would be free, which was something that had concerned her because Virginia followed the rule partus sequitur ventrum. In other words, you were what your mother was. That's how slavery was transmitted, which, as I've said, is a switch from the way it was in England. In England, you were what your father was. But when you came to America and they were setting up the slave system, they switched it. And you could think about why that's better or more convenient for a slave system to have slavery go through a woman as opposed to going through a man. Men have many more children than women. The sexuality of men is not as controlled, was not as tightly controlled as that of women, so you could create a large class of free mixed race people under those situations. So they switched it. And she understood that any child she had in Virginia would be born a slave. And so he promised her, Madison Hemings said, that her children would be free, and that eventually does happen. And she comes home with him. And this was my Sally Hemings problem. This is one of the things that took me a long time to come to grips with, and why it took me a while to get into the book trying to figure out how I was going to deal with that subject. Because you think, why would you come home? Why would you come back to Virginia to slavery? But it wasn't until I started working on the book and I realized how intensely connected the Hemings family was. It would be hard, I think, to leave your family. That was a real dilemma for enslaved people, not even people who are in France. I mean, do you run away? Do you run away to freedom by yourself, or do you stay with your family? That's the tragic, the sort of excruciating of the many things about the cruelties of slavery. That kind of dilemma was one that lots of enslaved people faced. And as I began to study the family and I realized how close they were, I could understand why she would come back. The other thing is I understood how Jefferson had treated her brothers up until this point, the rest of her family. Her older brothers were allowed to go off on their own and work on their own and keep their money. They could hire themselves out. It was actually against the law for him to let them do that, but they did. So you have this person who is in this relationship, to me, that looks like a state of war between a master and a slave, right? I mean, they are antagonists. But you are a person, the man who is the slave owner, is treating your family in a way that suggests that he doesn't exactly view it that way. In other words, I think it would be easy to use the word co-opt somebody or to convince someone to trust him because he had, in fact, treated her family differently than he treated other enslaved people on the plantation. And he did, and he ended up doing what he said he was going to do. And so it was easy for me to say, well, why would you trust him doing that? But she knew him and I didn't, and I don't. And so that was a difficult part for me, and we can talk in the question and answer period about this, but that was a real point of interest for me, and I would say a difficulty. But she was also 16 years old. And when I was writing this, my daughter, at the time when I was writing this section, my daughter was 16. And so I'm thinking, wow, but I know that an 18-year-old, in the 18th century, a 16-year-old in the 18th century is not a 16-year-old today. We've made childhood, I've said childhood up into the 30s, right? People are children forever now. It's like mommy, daddy, for a very long time. The age of consent in Virginia in the 18th century was 10. They were progressive and raised it to 12 in the 1820s. Madison at one point he meets this girl, he meets her when she's 12. He asks her to marry him when she's 15. He's 34. Jefferson is playing the matchmaker to this, trying to convince this girl, Kitty Floyd, to marry marry Madison, and she agrees, but then she kind of dumps him for a 19-year-old, and he's heartbroken. So there are all these people who are, John Marshall, the Chief Justice, started to court his wife when she was 13. He was 25. The family made them wait until she was 16, and then they got married as soon as she turned 16. So he's like 27, 28. 16-year-old girls, that was young. The average Virginia bride, I think, was about 19. But that meant, of course, that there are people above that and below it. But a 16-year-old girl would not have been thought of as a child in the 18th century. And I can't think of anywhere maybe people would know this, and I should do some investigations of this, but I can't imagine in Africa or in Europe, I just don't think that a 16-year-old in any society during that time period would have been thought of the way we think of a 16-year-old. You're a woman. I mean, there's no point in postponing marriage, sexual relations then, because women didn't go to school, women didn't have jobs, careers, you have babies, that's what you do. And the longer you wait to do that, the more problems you have, and people die in childbirth, which is, you know, how Elizabeth Hemings ended up as the concubine of John Wales that I mentioned. He had been married 3 times before, and each of his wives had died. He lost, 3 wives before he took Elizabeth as a concubine. So she decides, so this is a 16-year-old, there are all these problems that I have with this, the 16-year-old who comes back to America with Jefferson, and then I talk about, in the book, I introduce other people. If you've been to Monticello, you have probably seen the handiwork of a man named John Hemings, who was Sally Hemings' youngest brother. He was the master carpenter there, and Monticello has, the picture of, Jefferson has a book stand with 5 separate parts to it. John Hemings made that, the seed press, all those kinds of things. And John Hemings is important for another reason, because Jefferson put Beverly, Madison, and Eston Hemings, his sons with Sally Hemings, under the apprenticeship of John Hemings. And John Hemings was the person that he spent the most time with, the enslaved person he spent the most time with at Monticello, because Jefferson was a woodworker himself. He liked to make furniture. And so the sons become carpenters and musicians, and I talk about his relationship with them in the book, and the daughter Harriet, who is probably in some ways the most more obscure of all the children. And the book ends with the real tragedy at Monticello when Jefferson dies in 1826, bankrupt, $107,000 in debt. That's a lot of money in 1826. It's millions of dollars. And it was a tragedy for Jefferson's family, certainly for Jefferson's legal family, but it was an even bigger tragedy for the enslaved people in Monticello. 130 people were auctioned off 6 months after Jefferson's death. Some of them never saw their families ever again. So the legal Jefferson-Randolph suffered the loss of their home, but enslaved people suffered the loss of their families. You know, a house is a house, but your mother, your brother, your sister, that's another magnitude of loss, of potential loss. Sally Hemings and her sons, the 2 remaining sons, move into Charlottesville. She dies in 1835. And I end the book with the story of the Fawcett family. The Fawcetts are also Hemingses. Joseph Fawcett was a grandson of Elizabeth Hemings. He is freed in Jefferson's will, but his family is not freed. His wife and children aren't freed. Some members of the Hemings family buy freedom for some of the kids. One of them, Mary Hemings, owns a house. She has been freed by the white man that she was living with, who left her his property, and their children his property. She put the house up, got a loan, and bought some of her relatives. Joe Fawcett asked members of the white community to purchase some of his children and promised to buy them back, when he got enough money. And he was able to do that. He saved enough money over the years to buy some of them back. 2 of his daughters were taken out of the county, and we don't know what happened to them. But the youngest child, Peter, who was 11 when he was auctioned off, the man who bought him reneged on the deal and would not sell Peter back to his parents, even though they had the money for it. And they hang around in Virginia for a time, hoping to convince him, but he won't be convinced. And eventually, they leave the state because Nat Turner Rebellion happens in 1831, and they begin to crack down on free blacks in Virginia. And it gets to be too hard. So they move out to Cincinnati, and Joe Fawcett plies his trade as a blacksmith. And there's something of a happy ending because Peter, when he gets to be an adult, buys his freedom, moves out to Cincinnati with his family, He becomes a minister. He and a prominent caterer as well. His family becomes involved in the Underground Railroad in Cincinnati, and they spirit people to freedom from people from the Deep South. They help spirit them to freedom. And I ended the story with them instead of Sally Hemings and her children, because I think this story represents to me what the family symbolizes, what the family is about perseverance. I mean, here are these people in this situation that's just almost unimaginable. You know, the family auctioned off, children that you can't buy back. You have to buy your children back. And then somebody says, I don't want to sell them. And they never lose faith in one another. And they end up, as many of them as they could gather together in Cincinnati. And then they began to help other people. They don't just, stick to themselves. They risk a lot to help other people. And I think that that's the story of lots of African-American families, and why I think this family is extraordinary in some ways because of being at Monticello, and Jefferson was extraordinary. But in some ways, it's the story of lots of American families, the enslaved families, immigrant families, people who have gone through difficult times but stick together and try to do the best that they could do. And I felt that if I could make people make that connection to say, okay, my great-grandmother was not a slave, but my great-grandmother was an immigrant. My great-grandmother, one of the most gratifying things to me was having a man who came up to me and he was talking about the part of the book where I talk about Sally Hemings going to France by herself, or with Polly, Jefferson's daughter, when she's 9. And he said, it made me think about my grandmother who came to America from Italy when she was 15 years old. And she didn't speak a word of English, and she was going to be met by somebody here. But he said, I thought of how frightened she must have been on that trip over, and being in a place where she didn't understand the language and being at the mercy of other people. And an 18th century slave girl is very different from a 19th century or early 20th century Italian immigrant, but there's a point of humanity, of commonality there, enough of it that it made him think of his grandmother when he was reading about this person. And that's really, as I said at the very beginning, what I wanted to achieve. And I hope I have achieved that people can see the Hemingses in the context, the story of their lives, but also see the common humanity that makes us understand why slavery was the tragic and horrible thing that it was. So with that, I would like to take your questions. I think you're supposed to go to microphones, because I think they're recording this and they want to make sure everybody.
Hi. I was going to talk about the Wells family and Sally Hemings being Thomas Jefferson's wife's sister, but you covered that because we had a big fight with that like 30 years ago about that. But I want to ask, why is it so hard for them to put the whole history in the schools, especially at the secondary level of the schools, put the whole history?
Well, history is a very volatile thing. It's a powerful thing. To be able to tell, who gets to tell the story of the country is a really, really big deal. So I will say about this particular story, there are number of people who are doing young adult books and things. My daughter, when she was in the 4th grade, came home with a magazine called Footsteps, which I had actually done a piece for them, a little article in there about Madison Hemings. So this kind of thing is getting into schools, but the reason it's hard to put the whole story in, because people are fighting about what the story is, right? First, I will say this, I don't usually like to talk about like this, but I won the Pulitzer Prize. I'm the first black person ever to win the Pulitzer Prize in history. The first, right? The National Book Award, I was the first black woman to win for general nonfiction. People have won for fiction. But think of those two things, history and nonfiction. Those are about authority. That's an expression of authority. And I think there was and has been a long time, for a long time, some difficulty with women as authorities and blacks as authorities. You put those two things together, and it's a very contentious thing. I understand what you're saying, but I think that's the issue. People are arguing about what the story is, how you tell it, and history. We're a young country. It's amazing. We think we're, compared to, China, 5,000, 6,000 years of history. We've got a couple of hundred years, and things are still raw, right? There are things that are happening. There are people who, one of Jefferson's descendants was telling me that, his grandfather was somebody who lived a very, very long time, knew one of Jefferson's granddaughters. In other words, he was saying that there was a really close connection between him. He knew somebody who had sat at Monticello with Jefferson, essentially, is what he was saying. This is a young country, and we're still fighting about stuff. And so I'm hopeful. There are always battles about history. I'm hopeful that things are changing, but I do know that certainly slavery, writing about slavery is something that is completely different than when I was growing up. The presentation of it, so it's there, but it's going to be slow, and you got to realize history's not a joke. It's a very, very serious. It's politics. It's very political. People don't think of it, but it is very, very political, and it's hard. That's one of the hard things to do is to, not separate. You can't totally get rid of the politics, but it's always going to be there, and so you really, it's going to be contentious. I'll switch over to this side.
Thank you. People obviously in relationships act for a variety of motives and reasons, changing from time to time, and it's very, very complicated. It's very, very hard to parse. I'm wondering, in your research, did you find anything in the way of a feeling of affection between Sally Hemings and Jefferson, anything along those lines to at least partially explain this relationship, or is the record absent on that? Or what did you find?
The record, any sort of written record is absent on that. I mean, her family's oral history has a record, that talks about how Jefferson felt about her, but that's the grandchildren's oral history.
Going the other way, her feelings towards him.
And her why? No. It's all about him, his feelings about her. The only thing that I find interesting, and it's intriguing, and I don't know how to interpret it, but I mentioned it in the book, is that when she leaves Monticello, everything in Monticello is auctioned off to pay for stuff, but she keeps his glasses, pairs of his glasses, and items of his as heirlooms, and she gives them to her children as heirlooms. Now, I don't know what that means. But it's something. It's not like, let me totally get away from somebody, but to save these things for your children. And the funny thing is they tried to give them to Monticello in the 1920s. And first they were really excited, but then they explained where they came from, and then they said, no. So we don't know where those things are now. There are all these letters back and forth from, at Monticello describing what the items are and whatever, and then finally, no, thank you, we have enough of that kind of stuff. Of course, now they'd be like, give me this. No, but we have nothing except that, that to me is sort of an interesting thing for her to do. And the fact that she came back, but she can come back to be with her mother and her family and so forth. So we don't have anything from her to him. All the talk is the other way.
I have a couple of questions, but I have one comment, though. I thought that David Levering Lewis won the Pulitzer Prize for his...
For biography.
Yeah.
Biography is a separate category.
Okay. Couple of questions. Lewis of the Lewis and Clark fame, I think at one time was Jefferson's secretary. Mm-hmm. And he was given the task of basically quashing the story of Sally Hemings, his relationship with Sally Hemings. Mm-hmm. Apparently, I think when Thomas Jefferson was running for president, a journalist basically exposed that liaison, mm-hmm. and he told basically Lewis to go handle this
Give 50
exposure.
bucks.
And I just wanted to get your comments on it. My second question is, your comments regarding history as being political is quite intriguing, because I understand that there is currently a book that's being published that is attempting to refute some of the things that you're saying in your book. And I just wanted to get your comment on that. I can't remember the guy's name, but he's basically
William Highland.
right. He's basically calling you a liar.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, yeah. Okay, on the first question, Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson thought that Callender might be able to be silenced if he gave him money. So he sent Meriwether Lewis to talk to Callender with $50 to say, $50, and that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money in and this is in 1801, I think this is. That's a lot of money. That's $1,000, over $1,000 about that time period. So yeah, he tried to do that, but it just made Callender angry. Because see, Callender had been sent to jail under the Alien and Sedition Act. I mean, the Federalists had these acts, and you couldn't criticize the president. And he had been saying all these horrible things about President Adams. He got put in jail. So his position was, look, I've been the tack dog for your party. I went to jail for you, and now I ask you to make me postmaster, and you give me the back of your hand, and now you come to me with $50 saying, be quiet. So it didn't work. That's the point. William Highland is a lawyer, and he's had a book called In Defense of Thomas Jefferson. It's actually a beautiful book. It has a nice cover of Jefferson on the front of it. Very, is very, very, design-wise. I haven't read the entire book. I read the article. What he did was he wrote an article called Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings versus Thomas Jefferson, a civil action or something like that. And it's because he's a lawyer, it's like a case to present the case defending Thomas Jefferson. Of course, what the answer is going to be, just from the presentation of it. And it was really, really silly. I mean, it's really pretty poor, subpar in terms of, he doesn't know anything about slavery, and he doesn't know anything about Jefferson. And he put those two things together, it's a disaster. And so what he does in the book, essentially, is to take the core of that article, and then I gather, because people have told me what this is about, is, basically a sort of an attack on the sort of a cabal of people who, in academia, liberal academia, who, people who are foisting this politically correct view of slavery onto, and Jefferson onto. And the strange thing about it is they think I'm out to destroy Jefferson. It's odd, because half the time I get criticized because people are saying, you're apologizing for him. And then the other half of the people say, you're trying to destroy him. And it's interesting to see how people can read the same things and come to totally different views about what it is. But that book has been published, and so it's out there, and I would urge people to read it, because it's subpar. I mean, it's laughable. I mean, no, seriously. I mean, it's very, very hard to write about this subject without writing about slavery. And it's not just, or knowing about Monticello, life at Monticello. I mean, there are just things. I remember one part, he talks about the Hotel Olangiac, where Jefferson lived in Paris, and described it as this sort of cramped two-bedroom townhouse. And we have the floor plan to this place. It was a mansion. L'Hotel de Langeac. L'Hotel means great house. It doesn't mean cramped townhouse. So there are little factual things that he doesn't like the story. And so he doesn't like the story, but he didn't want to do the work, the research that it takes to actually to deal with it. So yeah, this will never stop. I don't ever have any expectation that this is, going to stop, because as I said, it's about more. I mean, come on. I mean, attacking Thomas Jefferson because he has a mistress. I mean, here's a guy who, as I said, owned upwards of 700 people over the course of his life, who bought and sold people. But the thing that is the worst thing that he ever did was to have children with this woman and free the children. She ends up informally freed. I mean, slavery is over for that family in 1826, 4 decades before it's over for most African Americans. And that's the worst thing Jefferson did, not buying and selling people, not separating families, that. There's something else going on beyond just, a concern about Jefferson's image, because there's so many other things that I would put, ahead of that as a problem. So, yeah, so that's where we are. It's William Highland. He is, as I said, a lawyer, and it's called In Defense of Thomas Jefferson, and it's really the case against Annette Gordon-Reed. Which is always kind of fun.
Yes, I have two questions. The first question, did Jefferson allow the Hemings to learn to read and write? And how much was a slave selling for at the time of Thomas Jefferson?
Well, two things. The Hemings is, Sally Hemings' brothers, her 3 full older brothers, knew how to read and write. But we don't have anything from Sally Hemings or her sisters. I mean, Robert Hemings, Jefferson, in one of the records that he kept, the summary journal of letters, he kept a record of all the letters he sent and all the letters that came back to him. So we know that he and Robert Hemings corresponded, but all those letters are gone. They're no longer extant. We know James Hemings knew how to read and write, and Peter Hemings knew how to read and write, but we don't know about the women. So Jefferson's grandchildren taught the Hemings children how to read and write. His granddaughters taught them how to read and write. But we don't really know how Sally Hemings' brothers learned how to read and write, whether their father taught them to read, John Wales, or maybe even Martha Jefferson. But they certainly were literate people. We just don't know how they came about it. Slave prices Jefferson lived a very long time. Slave prices fluctuated. They were not as high as they were in the antebellum period, where slaves were, for thousands of dollars. Once cotton comes in, and then the price of slaves rise tremendously. And once the Louisiana Purchase is made, and then the markets and the, slavery begins to expand, hundreds to thousands of dollars, depending upon whether you were a field hand. Children obviously were worth less. But enslaved women who were sold as what they called fancy women could bring thousands of dollars in New Orleans and places. So depending upon, it's like the market. I mean, slavery is a business. And slaves are commodities. And in given years, commodities go up and down. But it was always profitable. Its property is always profitable.
Thank you.
Hi. Your book is an experience to read it and to read it over time and to think about what's happening today in terms of all the thought-provoking things you say. I was reading your book during the inauguration, and I was at the point where Sally Hemings was traveling to England with Jefferson's daughter, and it struck me how you spoke about her and how there wasn't a thought that she was worth protecting from the sailors. Mm-hmm. And I contrasted that with Sasha and Malia and this ideal of, this public expression of that these girls are worth protecting and that they're so worthwhile. And I was wondering if you think we have come far, or do you think that, what does that represent?
Well, what she's talking about is when Sally Hemings goes to London with Jefferson's daughter, Polly. She's 14 years old, and Polly's 9. And Jefferson had asked for Polly to come over with a middle-aged woman. A careful Negro woman is the way he describes it, a woman named Isabel Hearn, who was about 30. But instead, his sister-in-law, Betsy Epps, who was also Sally Hemings' his half-sister, keeping all this Virginia genealogy going here, sends Sally Hemings over. And at one point, the captain of the ship and Abigail Adams talk about the possibility. They say, well, she's not going to be worthwhile in Jefferson's household. Why don't we send her back? And what I talk about is, well, that seems like a pretty dumb idea, right? To send a 14-year-old girl. Abigail thinks she's 16. To send a 16-year-old girl, she thinks, on a 6-week cruise with a bunch of sailors by herself with no chaperone. And that's not something, and I don't think that that's something they would have thought of for a white girl. a free white girl. And so I'm asking the reader to think about, what is it like to be in a world where where you're not valued, where no one thinks about that thing, that kind of, the potential problem with that. We've certainly come we've come a long way since slavery. But surely, I mean, the whole issue of the devaluation of African American women is still present, and this is something that gets started in slavery, and we are still, I think, living with that legacy in lots of ways, in the depictions of African American women, the views of them, but certainly Sasha and Malia. That would have been inconceivable from the 18th and the 19th century that they would be in that situation, and that's what makes them, in some ways, I mean, it's extraordinary to have an African American president, but in some ways it's almost more extraordinary to have an African American first family, to have a first lady who is black, that term lady, to have her, some people, think about her as a fashion icon, and they think that sort of trivializes things, but on the other hand, there's the other flip side of it, that you don't typically have images of African American women that are positive in that way. I mean, even as a fashion icon, it's either something deeply sexual, or the mammy figure, or the best friend, the wise best friend who always has the answer on the TV show. So it's fascinating to see culturally, whatever happens politically, culturally, what this moment will mean for kids, not so much us, but for little children who grow up seeing them in that role. It'll be interesting to see what happens, what grows out of that, because it's bigger than just the politics or whatever votes are being taken. It's how young people perceive what the country is about when you have these people as examples.
Good evening, Professor Reed. I have two questions. My first is concerning Harriet Hemings. I'm sort of obsessed with what happened to her. And I wanted to know, in your research, have you found any information on what happened to her after she left the plantation? And my second question is, I've just finished reading Incidents in a Slave Girl's Life by Harriet Jacobs, and it's changed my entire perspective on the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sarah Hemings. And I was wondering, in your research, did you think, I'm at the point of almost saying he was a serial rapist, and do you think that she had a choice in the relationship?
Okay, so the first one, Harriet, that's something that I want to try to track down when I do the second volume of writing about the Hemings family. I broached it a little bit when I was working on the first book. Washington has city directories from the 1820s, and I went through those trying to think of different, because they must have changed their names. Harriet and Beverly, Beverly is a male, William Beverly, they must have changed their names. And I was trying to think of all the different permutations they might have tried, and I gave up on it because my first book really was not about that, and I said, you got to stop this, you got to go on and finish the book. I want to go back to that at some point, and it could be a needle in the haystack. I mean, it is a needle in the haystack. People periodically show up saying that they are the descendants of Harriet, like Anastasia, you remember the woman who was supposed to be the Roman, the Romanov heir. But nobody has really made the connection, because by the two eldest children leave Monticello as white people. They are not formally freed. And you think about it, I mean, if they get formal freedom, that means that you were a slave, and if you were a slave, that means you're part black, and if you're trying to pass for white, you don't want that, right? So they go off as white people, and because they don't spend any time in the black community, we have no record of them. Eston, the youngest, stays in the black community for a time and then goes into the white community. But because of his time in the black community, census, those kinds of things, under his real name, we're able to track him to a certain point. But the two eldest, I mean, they just disappear and they're gone. Now, as to choice, when she's in France, she's not under Virginia law. Certainly when she's in Paris, there with her brother. People forget that her brother is there. Her brother is 24 years old. And in the book, I talk about, I mean, he's doing things that indicate that it's not just, she's not the only one who's saying, I'm going to stay. But when they're about to leave, he hires a tutor to teach him French grammar, which is not the kind of thing that you would do to spend, spend the last, year and a half learning a language formally if you think you're going back to Virginia forever. So she could have stayed there with him, with James, and it would have been interesting if she had. Part of me wishes she had, and that I would have had an excuse to go to Paris. But then other people said, "Man, you wouldn't have had a story either, right?" But I think I would have still. Maybe people wouldn't have been as interested in it, but yeah, it would have been interesting if they had stayed there in the black community and tried to make a go of it. Did she have a choice? I think she had more of a choice. She had a choice when she's in Paris. Once she comes back to the United States, she's totally under his control because, she's back under Virginia law. I get some resistance from people, who say that, well, it's almost as if because she was born a slave in Virginia, wherever she went in the world, she would have that same attitude, and that's not true. Slaves often went to free soil and said, I'm not going back, and lots of people in Paris did that. So did she have a choice in Paris? Yes. Does she have a choice when she comes back? When she comes back to Virginia? No. A choice, if you factor in the family part of it as well, wanting to be with your family, that factors into the notion of choice as well, because she may be thinking, well, I can't leave my mother, I can't leave that, but that's different than you have to stay with me. She did not have to stay with him in Paris. There were abolitionist society groups, there were people, she had money, as I said, they were getting paid. But once she comes back to Virginia, she's under his control at that point, and there's not much she could do.
Well, I want to thank you so much for all of the work that you did in this book and really laying things out in such a logical way. And clearly there are people who will always question what you do. But I found it particularly interesting that Jefferson loved his wife very much, but that she was a person who had grown up in a household with several stepmothers. Mm-hmm. And that I interpreted your description of her death and his life afterwards, that she didn't want her children to go through what she had gone through, mm-hmm. and he never remarried. And mm-hmm. so this was a man whose wife, who he loved very much, had died when he was still very young, and that he would never have sex again, which is what the people who want to say that this didn't happen seem to want to believe. But I just wonder if you would talk a little bit about that relationship and how he would have lived the rest of his life.
Okay.
Not as a celibate man, I'm guessing.
I would do that and go back to something that I didn't answer the last part of what you were saying. Yes, she. The story that the Hemings family, this is a story that comes from the Hemings women, that being Martha, asked Jefferson not to remarry because she didn't want another woman over her children. So it's not about, don't marry because I want you from me forever, eternity. It wasn't that. It was, the suggestion is maybe I don't want them to have stepmothers. And if you think about, we tend to think about all the sort of emotional aspects of what would have been going on there. A daughter with a father who has a mistress and an unmarried father who has a girlfriend. But the people at that time period were very, very much obsessed with property. Property, what rules these people in lots of ways is property. You remember in the book when Jefferson comes back from Paris, his cousin, who is going to be his daughter's father-in-law, she marries her second cousin, is 50 years old. His wife has died in 1789. In 1790, he marries the 17-year-old neighbor, next door neighbor, and proceeds to have children with her, and then proceeds to disinherit his first batch of kids. His eldest son is named Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. He has a son with Gabriella Harvey, the 17-year-old, and he names him Thomas Mann Randolph. It's like he just erases the first son. And in doing that, he gives Tuckahoe, which is the grand plantation that still exists down in Virginia, to the baby, not to his eldest son. So these people, Jefferson's daughters, I mean, for women, the worst thing that could happen, the worst thing could have happened to Jefferson's daughters would be if Jefferson had married again. If he'd gotten married again, he could have had another 12 kids. And where would that leave Martha? You know, everybody talks about Jefferson and his grandchildren. If Jefferson had gotten married again and had a bunch of legal white kids, he would never have had the relationship with his grandchildren or with his eldest daughter that he had. If he'd had sons, Thomas Jefferson Jr. So this idea that Martha is, oh, this is the worst thing that could have happened to me, Martha, his daughter. The worst thing would have been Sarah Hemings, white woman, free white woman, marrying Thomas Jefferson. The children he has with her don't count. They're not going to inherit anything. They're not going to get Monticello. And they're not going to get the prestige of being legal heirs. So it was pretty clear that, you know, if this didn't in fact happen, he promised his wife that he wasn't going to get married again. This was not a promise not to have sex anymore. And she knew that because her father, because she's got her half-siblings sitting around her bed from her father, who had taken a concubine instead of getting married for the fourth time. So she knew that she wasn't asking him to become celibate. But this goes back to what I was saying before at the very beginning about a founding father. Nobody wants to think about their parents having sex. Their real parents or their metaphorical parents. You know, so Jefferson at 39, his wife dies and he never has sex again, and he dies when he's 83. And so the alternative is, and there is an alternative, and this is the strange thing about it, the alternative would be not just Sally as a mistress. The alternative would be galloping through the slave quarters, right? So, you know, it's interesting, Duma Malone, at the end of his life, he's the 6-volume biography of Jefferson, says, you know, I could see him having sex with her once or twice, but I can't believe that it was 38 years. Now think about that. That's very interesting. I mean, once or twice, the difference between casually using somebody once or twice, it was the length of it that bothered him, because the length of it means he's not like a white man in a way. I mean, he's basically saying, look, you know, men are men. Of course, you know, you could sleep with a black woman a couple of times. I mean, you know, you find out what it's like, you know, you do this. But living in a long thing, that's a real problem. And so it's odd that you would prefer, because they really can't have thought that he would never ever have sex again from 38 to 83. So what would he be doing? Going to brothels? The alternatives are brothels, running through the slave quarters, or having a concubine, and somebody who's just sort of like one of his friends said in the diary, a substitute for a wife. That's what she was, and that's the way people viewed it. So it's a real question, and there are some stories. And I talk about them in the book. There are people who claim descent from Jefferson through 2 other women, 2 of Sally Hemings' older sisters. But I haven't been able to find anything to corroborate that. And in one of them, they're claiming descent from a person. Jefferson was in Paris when this person was conceived and born, so he couldn't possibly be it. So it's possible that there are other people, but the thing is, there aren't any. I mean, for a historian looking at this stuff, there are no other names. I find it interesting that, you know, they know the names of Sally Hemings' children, their ages, where they are, but nobody ever mentions the name of another woman in the time period. It's always Sally, Sally, Sally. It's not anybody else. You get the stories of other women in the 1940s, and not to say that it's not true, and I do talk about them in endnotes there, but I can't find anything from the time period that corroborates that. And if I can't find anything from the time period, then I can't. And if I find things that are against it, like Jefferson's in Paris, when this kid is conceived, and the woman is in Virginia, then I have to say, no, it doesn't work.
Yes, I would like to get your comment about Jefferson on the character issue, because I personally, read a lot about him, and I find him to be even more despicable than the regular slave owner, because you get the impression that he knew that slavery was wrong, but he did it for convenience. He did it for convenience. I mean, he had somebody to wait on him 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I find that kind of person more despicable, let's say, than a person who's just doing it for economic reasons, let's say. And also Jefferson, the law professor, George Wythe. When I lived in Richmond, I found out that George Wythe had a black woman and a 14-year-old son that was living with him in Richmond. And he changed his will, leaving the house to the woman and half of his bank account to the boy. His nephew, his grandnephew, then poisoned all three of them. And the woman survived, but she couldn't testify because she was black. Wythe died, the boy died. This was Jefferson, the law professor. Jefferson was president at the time. He allowed this man to get away with murder rather than to confront it. So,
Well,
could you comment a little bit about Jefferson and the character
And the
issue?
character question. Yes, George Wythe and Lydia Broadnax and Michael Brown. George Wythe left Jefferson as the guardian of Michael Brown, the boy who died, and asked Jefferson to tutor him and have him come to Monticello. And he was supposed to be the guardian, but Michael died, and so Jefferson writes to Lydia Broadnax because she asks him for money at some point because she ends up, in economic straits, and so he writes to her about this and sends her money. I do think he thought that slavery was wrong. I think he knew that slavery was wrong, but I guess it's just, to me, the whole thing is despicable. I don't know that I distinguish between people who are doing it just for economic reasons. I think he was doing it for economic reasons too. He tells a story about his first memory is being lifted onto a pillow by a slave. His family's taking a trip from Shadwell to Tuckahoe to live, and that's his first memory as a child. And his grandson tells a story about his last day before he dies, that everybody's gathered around the bed. That seems to be the motif of this time period. People die at home and everybody's there. And Jefferson says something and nobody understands him except Burl Colbert, who is Sally Hemings' nephew. And what he's saying is that he wants to be lifted up higher. And so that's what Burl does, that and lifts him up, and he closes his eyes and he never wakes up. So his first picture, his first sight is of an enslaved person, and his last one was an enslaved person. This is something that bounded his life. And I think it's one thing to know something is wrong, but there are lots of things that we intellectually know are wrong, but emotionally we can't bring ourselves to live according to those intellectual beliefs. This is not an apology for him in any way, but I think that slavery was this was that phrase, way of life for people. Slavery brought, as you said, comforts, as you mentioned, economic security for him, but emotional security for him as well. The Hemingses are part of a sort of an emotional connection that he has, that we find despicable, as you say, but this is something that he's mired in. And I think it's very hard for people to do things differently from the way they're raised. Very few people, most of the people who turn against slavery during Jefferson's time are religious people. Quakers, Methodists, Baptists, people who have it in their heads that somehow, Christianity tempers or should say something about the institution of slavery. Jefferson was not religious. Jefferson did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God or that Jesus was divine or that there was any resurrection or anything like that. And religion can move people to do things that are irrational in a good way, that is to say, give up all of your property or fly a plane in a building. From beliefs that are religious. But if he didn't have that, this is about ethics, and ethics is kind of namby-pamby, right? It's not, it isn't something that makes you it doesn't move you to passion in that way. So I think he thought that slavery was going to die. This is a crazy thing about it. All that generation of people thought this is a retrograde economic system, is going to die out. Think of something that we think today. Oh, one of these days, people are going to know better. I mean, no, we do. I mean, I'm trying to just think of in your life. One of these days, people are going to know better, and they're going to do. It'll progress. And of course, then Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin, and cotton becomes king, and slave prices go up into the thousands. But he actually, that's what he thought was going to happen. What he thought his mission was, okay, I founded the United States of America, okay, and now the next generation of people, you will take this forward, and progress will come, and he was a believer in progress. Hamilton, other people had a much darker view of human nature, but Jefferson thought that people were essentially good. And eventually, this is a problem that would be worked out, and he was wrong. It worked out in the way we know it worked out with a war. So the character question is very definitely there, but as I said at the very beginning, I think it's there for Washington, it's there for all these people. How do you own other people? How do you see people who have families and separate them? Buy them and sell them as commodities? It's hard. There's nothing that I could think of now. I suppose there may come a time, maybe 100 or 150 years from now, people will say, when it's, the average temperature 90 degrees, people will say, what the heck were those people thinking? Or meat. For example, people say, you may say, what do you do? You mean you have factories where you hit a cow in the head with a mallet, and then, there are all kinds of things that you think that right now that we do, but I know it's hard for us to wrap our mind, it is, around slavery. This notion of ownership of human beings, except this was something that was, that too was across lots of culture. As well. Slavery is something, it was not like it was here, but, owning people, the sort of hierarchy that people have, he's born into a world of hierarchy. White over black, males over female, rich people over poor people. This is fit into that category of hierarchy that, we still have to some degree, but nowhere near what it was like then. So to me, it's more interesting to obviously he is a subject for me, and in studying him there's a point of interest here, whether condemning or not. It's much more to try to figure out what made him tick and what made his time, and what his times were like. How did people live the way they lived, and how different they are from us, and how in some ways we're struggling with our own problems that we're not resolving, that later generations may look back on us and say, why didn't they do something? Is that it? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.